Well, hey, I really appreciate the invitation to come talk to Nerd Night Austin tonight. My topic is going to be about uh, it's actually kind of a misnomer, Underground Railroad in Texas, right? I prefer to talk about it as the Texas Trails to Freedom. Um, Building off the prior talk, I mean, one of the things is kind of communication is really key. And one of the things that we really suffer from here in Texas is not enough of honest communication and open discussion about our history. And since it's both, Valentine's month and also Black History Month, I wanted to show a little love to some of the undeveloped stories of Texas and specifically related to the struggles that happened with slavery. So let's see, I don't know if I'm even driving at this point. Oh, here we go. All right. So whenever we talk about the Underground Railroad, right, we always think about the route north up into Canada, right? This has been much more researched, much more well known, um, but there's a lesser known southern route. And the southern route is what I'm interested in into Texas. And actually, also, some of these also led into parts of Oklahoma for reasons that we'll discuss in a second. But there wasn't really an underground railroad per se, the same way that we think about. Like if you've seen the Harriet Tubman movies or read about those books, they had stations, they had established routes where they would go from point to point to point to point. In the North, it was much more better organized. That's not the case in Texas. One of the things that I need to set up, though, is that this is actually an emergent area of research. I mean, since, well, at least like 2015, just within the last 20 years, as we've had an influx of new scholars into the field, especially ones that are Latinx, and exploring these kind of against the grain histories, where what we do is we go back and look at history, not from the dominant white male narrative of Texas, but look at it from the terms of Tejanos or Latinas and the different groups that made up the Mexico Texas. It provides a really interesting and enlightening counter perspective. So, one of the things that's kind of important to think about here is that this route to Texas, this map that I have displayed now, you see these big major veins going up north, but look down to the lower part in Texas. And this is one of the things that I pitched to Amy. I was like, hey, Austin actually plays a tail in this story, as does Denton. This is how I got into it. And that's what's going to unfold through this talk. So where it kind of begins is with slavery was totally made illegal in Mexico. The president of Mexico, Vicente Ramon Guerrero Saladana, he was actually the person that actually banned and refused to negotiate any type of treaties that had to do with extraditing slaves. Now, I think it's worth noting here that he was also himself a black Mexican. And by black Mexican, I want to be really careful here. What I'm talking about is that he was of descent that was mixed, who led the Revolutionary War there in Mexico and against Spain. And so when they gained independence, Vicente Saladana here became president. And as president, he took a very firm stance and was like, nope, fuck no. If slaves get over here, they're protected. And by the way, we're also not making deals with you guys in Texas. And so, of course, Texas wasn't a fan of this, right? So the Texians, this is another myth, that Texians that came and settled and colonized the Texas, Mexico, or Mexico, Texas at that time, right before the Revolutionary War, they, of course, came in large part from the South. They were bringing their slave customs with them. And they actually did a lot of like really shady dealing in terms of like, not, they violated treaties all the time. And they also like created through bribery, interesting loopholes with the country of Mexico. So there's a lot of shady stuff going on. But from the get go, the escape of slaves down into Texas was a really foremost concern. So this is one important thing to remember is that Texas began and started as a slavery empire. I know there's a lot of debate today. People talk a lot about, oh man, no, slavery, it was about states' rights or whatever. That's all fucking horseshit. It was slavery from the get go, like literally before they were even a part of the United States. The whole point was slavery, and the whole tension with Mexico was slavery, in fact. Um, so, actually, between 1820 and 1855, and estimations vary. I mean, we can't track this. This is one of the problems. It's a challenge for historians. Is that a lot of what we're trying to record or find or discover is actually being made possible through new innovations in digitization of libraries. And Amy, I'm going to talk about the Austin Library and the public library system as an important resource because guess what? Some of this shit just pops on the radar like every month. Every month, something new will be digitized, and I'll get some alert because of keywords that I search, and I'll find out some new clue. It's absolutely amazing. Um, but here's a few highlights. I mean, we hear about the Underground Railroad and it's Black History Month. Yay, yay, let's celebrate the Underground Railroad. Well, guess what? Texas had a crazy, weird, disconnected network of its own that we're still trying to discover. So this is one of the reasons like talking to you folks in Austin is so important to me is because if some of you take an interest and start doing some digging around, it might be amazing. You might be uncover parts of history that are close to being forgotten. So here's a few highlights, just some touchstones of some of the exploits. So in 1844, 25 mounted and armed slaves just fucking picked up in Bastrop, Texas, got pissed, and they were like, fuck this shit, we're out of here. And they headed off to the border. Now, only 7 to 8 were known to have made it, but holy fucking God, once they got there, they were legend. And you better believe that this actually spread like wildfire through the slave communities of Texas. Um, in 1849, this is another interesting story. So the Black Seminoles, they're a fascinating story that began with like in Florida, and escaped slaves who went down there and blended with the Indian tribe there. And then you had General, soon to be future President Jackson, uh, drives them out of Florida into the Indian territory. It's now Oklahoma. Um, and they were constantly harassed. Treaties were broken. And again, we had another fuck that moment where Seminole Indian Chief Wildcat was like, fuck this noise. What we're doing is we're heading down to Mexico where we're going to lay claim to land. And so here's where it gets like hazy because I have here between 150 and 800 natives. It was a big group. And as they were rolling down through Texas, you better believe that caused some noise. Okay. Um, because whenever they went through, what they did was they headed down to Mexico, and sure enough, they were given a land grant by the Mexican government at Piedras Negras is the place, and I'll show you that on the map here shortly. But the deal was, look, hey, you guys create basically a freed Black Indian settlement here in Mexico, and what we'll do is we'll give you a land grant to settle that property. And that's exactly what they did. Now, what this did was then sets up an impetus in 1850. Several hundred blacks, they routed Creek Indians who were a slaveholding tribe. And what they did was they also escaped into Mexico. 1856, a large group, perhaps as big as 400, they hired out some Tejano like labor workers, and they actually said, "Hey, we know where to take you." And so what happened was they devised a plan to rise up and escape into Mexico. That one didn't end so well because we're at 1856. We're almost up to the Civil War at 1860. Sentiments by then had gotten kind of bananas. And of course, in 1857, the government again refuses to sign the treaty. I mean, following the uh, the uh, escaped slave policies of the United States, Mexico still completely refused to negotiate at all. So Mexico was a completely safe haven. This is what's really interesting about Mexico as opposed to Canada. If a slave escaped into Canada, and there were many instances of this, uh, you would have like literally slave rovers who would go up, and what they would do is they would recapture them and drag them across, the U.S. border in the middle of the night. That was a lot less likely to happen in Mexico because, again, you had like armed people. They were there like, no, we're not just counting on the government. We're all armed and guns. So if you show up here, get ready to go hot. And of course, another highlight of this event was the very weird and stupid 1855 raid. There were 111 Texas Rangers that went into Mexico to try to recover escaped slaves. It was called the Callahan Expedition. It was a fucking nightmare. So they went down there to try to recover the slaves. They had gotten word that they were coming. They actually set up an ambush. They ambushed them, scattered them, and then what happened was they wound up burning Piedras Negras to the ground, or at least large portions of it. So it became a disastrous international incident, and that's where like the United States and Texas versus Mexico basically became a fuck you, we are not dealing with you situation from then on out. So another couple of unsung heroes is how did they find their way to Mexico? Well, the answer is there were lots of Indian trails and wagon trails that were being developed. This is Jesse Chisholm and Black Beaver. By the way, Black Beaver is his own talk. Like, you need to explore Black Beaver, because Black Beaver himself um, actually helped blaze a lot of these trails with Jesse Chisholm. Later, they turned, of course, into the Chisholm Trail, the cattle trails that went north. But what they were doing was exploring all these trails south. This is the map over on the left-hand side, because this was the edge of civilization. This was the edge of the frontier where they built forts in order to protect against Indians who we were, coming into their house and taking their land, and they're kind of pissed off about it. And by the way, we kept violating their treaties as Texians. And so they weren't very happy about that. So that's also one of the factors that is that, these trails that led south and wound up leading north again during the Chisholm Trail cattle drive days post Civil War. This was actually creating small communities and pockets. Now, these were coming in alongside, Tejanos. These are people who were of both Mexican descent who lived in Mexico, Texas, and then even after independence, actually they still lived there and developed there. Um, so one of the things under the Constitution of Texas that's important to keep in mind is that as soon as the republic was established, this is a quote, all persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude, provided the said slave shall be bona fide property of the person so holding them. And as far as like helping slaves escape, there was also an important provision because it said, quote, every person who shall steal or entice away a slave out or from the possession of the owner or owners of such a slave shall be deemed guilty of felony, and on conviction thereof shall suffer death. It was the death penalty to actually help a slave. Now, one of the fascinating things is, of course, the way that this narrative emerges is actually through the stories of former slaves themselves. Felix Haywood has a great interview with the WPA where what happened was they asked him about, like, hey, Felix, did you ever think about running away north into Canada and escape? And he actually laughed. He laughed at them and he was like, shit, man, there's no reason to run up north. All we had to do was like just cross over into Mexico and we were free away. So this is actually where some of this, even the South Texas and Central Texas slaves knew. They knew through some of these acts that I identified before that there was clearly an escape route into Mexico. The map that I have here is absolutely money. This is one of my favorite maps that'll keep popping up. So what you see is you see three major routes that actually depart through South Texas. Let me see. Sorry, I ran off from my notes here. So what we have is up to the northerly route was actually Piedras Negras. And Piedras Negras was actually on the border. And this is where Wildcat had taken the Black Seminole, and they established their place across the border. And then there's down by Laredo, Nuevo Leon. This was another route that was actually there. If escaped slaves were able to make it there, they knew that they would have passage across the Rio Grande. And then the furthest south point, Tamaulipas and Matamoros, I'm probably butchering these terribly, I apologize. But this southernmost point actually has some fascinating history that's been uncovered that I'm going to talk to you about here in a second. So here was the deal, is that this escape, right, created a huge environment of lots of tension that was going to be going to cause difficulties. These escaped slaves, for example, they would get into like, there were actually even freedmen in Texas who were actually discouraged from and actually run out of Mexico. Let me see which route I'm on. I'm on slide 10. Sorry, I'm trying to get caught up. I've got like two different screens going on here. So yeah, so one of the things is this challenges a couple of narratives we have. First of all, route of migration. So one of the dominant, like kind of American myths is that people were trying to migrate into the United States. This actually shows that actually there was a southern migration that was also occurring of people that are trying to escape the U.S. into Mexico. One of the things that's important to keep in mind too is that what we have here is we have a woodcut description from Harper's Weekly of a group of African Americans who have a showdown with basically white slave trackers, right? And so it turns into a melee. This is one of the biggest threats of slaves trying to escape. Of course, what happened was they actually established, this is how the Texas Rangers got established. There's a great new book on the history of the Texas Rangers that actually talks about it. And what they do is they point out like, yeah, they started out basically as, you know, trying to basically, you know, police and patrol escaped slaves, and also Mexican. They always called them Mexican, even though they were Tejano. They were probably in this territory before the Texians showed up to try to colonize it. That they had a lot of sympathies with the African Americans, but these Texas Rangers and these roving bands of like mercenaries and slave hunters actually, you know, roamed the territory. But it was really big, it was really wide, and it was really wild. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind is how fucking dangerous it was. Is this trail, if you came from East Texas and you try to get down to the coastal bend, right, try to get down to the Rio Grande to cross over, there were slave patrols, there were slave hunters, but there's also a lot worse. So once you cross over the New Isis Wild Horse Desert, once it appears, that's roughly around where the King Ranch area is. This is the most treacherous part of the trip. And the reason was it was just a personal struggle between runaway slave and the barren environment. There were venomous diamondback rattlesnakes, scorpions, tarantulas, brown recluse spiders, just that shit, just along the way is happening. And then once you get in the Laguna Anticosta regions, lakes had alligators, had fucking gators in it. So we have no idea how many people actually were able to make the getaway. We just know that it was really fucking dangerous. Oh, and by the way, there was also the Karankawa Indian tribe, so when down in that desert region, they were kind of predominant because of the harsh conditions. They also were not averse to cannibalism. So you had that shit to deal with. So to talk about like this being a treacherous journey is really kind of an understatement. It's really tough to kind of dig up evidence because we don't have any like underground paths or records. Because again, if you were caught with records that you were helping slaves, you were going to be killed. You were going to be dead. And so there's a lot of interest in like coded messages and quilts that might have been signals. That's things that are still being investigated. And of course, this huge new surge of scholarship has been amazing. Thanks in large part to these, as I mentioned, the digitization efforts of public universities and libraries, oral history detectives, genealogical research. This has been an unexpected boon, is as people post like letters and personal correspondences of their family, you, people who are trained to like find these signals go like, holy shit, they're talking about that pass to Pedras Negras, or or down south to Laredo. So this huge scholarship has really been the trail has been blazed by a lot of new ethnic scholars who bring, like, again, reading the history against the grain. And so that's where old timers like me, old white guys with white beards, they're presenting a lot of new interesting scholarship that's just totally fantastic. So they did have a little bit of help along the way. So one of the things about Texas is, of course, is kind of the usual suspects. So Tejano Vaqueros, the original cowboys who invented all of this, right? And then indentured Mexican peons, people who were just basically wage slaves at the time on farms and ranches. Um, they, of course, identified with a lot of the slaves. And so they were known to like provide information, offer recommendations, targets, places to go, and even sometimes offer to be a guide if they could get a little money. And so this also leads to a lot of racist crackdowns and even expulsion by Texas authorities during the 1840s and 1850s. There's also German settlers. This is one of the things we don't think about a lot, is these German settlements, they were courted for Texas land grants to bring people in to settle colonies. So of course you have some, the map here is showing through South Texas where the German element, right, where these German settlements are. There were also some up in Denton. And this is one of the interesting things, is they were thoroughly, because of their religious beliefs, abolitionist. And so even though they weren't really public about it, if they ran across a runaway slave, they were more than likely to give them assistance and help and guidance. So this is something, again, that's hard to track except through like really personal stories. But they were sympathetic to the plight of the enslaved runaways. And then, of course, some Native American tribes, the Black Seminole that I mentioned before, they were known to help enslaved runaways. And also other tribes, even Comanche, either out of sympathy or just, fuck whitey, right? They hated the Texians. And so they were like, oh, you want to get away? Man, that's going to piss him off. Here, let me give you some food and fucking head that way, right? So it's really interesting how precarious things were out on the Texas frontier. You're at the edge of civilization. And so this is one of the things that they did, was sometimes they had just these ad hoc as they went. Most scholars think that, yeah, there wasn't an unorganized underground railroad. There was just a loose network where if somebody saw somebody and helped them, they would kind of point them to the next possible area, right? Um, but it was always a risky gamble, and that's the thing, and that's why we have no idea of like any kind of good count of how many made it, how many didn't, how many died in the desert. But these blended tribes of Black Seminoles, yeah, as I mentioned, Chief Wildcat led the Exodus in 1849. So at least since then, Pedro Negras was known as a destination. If you could get there, God damn it, you'd be okay. As soon as your feet touch the shore, you'd be all right. And their descendants still live there today. Um, Slave catching mobs occasionally ventured into Mexico, and this didn't turn out well, like zero times. Like so, so this was always also a reason, like the Texas Rangers were formed, was there were a couple of times they tried to poke down into Mexico to recapture slaves, and they were always met with fierce armed resistance, and so that didn't go well. The escaped slaves, they often adopted Spanish names and they married into Mexican families and even migrated deeper into Mexico. There's actually an amazing story I don't have time to tell, but Sam Houston had two of his slaves that escaped into Mexico. And when he was asked about it, he was actually kind of cavalier. He was like, you know what? Those two guys are super smart, and I think they'll be a credit to Mexico. I think they'll do great down there and help really develop Mexico, right? Well, it turns out about 5 years later, a Texan general who was being a jackass and led an expedition into Mexico got captured and thrown into jail. And he happened to see Sam Houston's two slaves. He recognized them. He called them out by name, and they were like, "Oh, hey, motherfucker, how are you doing?" Not good. And they actually had a conversation where he saw that they were doing great in Mexico. They were like, "No, man, we come down here, we do English to Spanish, Spanish to English. We're doing gangbusters down here. So, hey, enjoy your trip back. And also, don't eat the beef jerky." So, anyway, so this is one of the things um, about the trip down south, right? Is that it was a complex and deceiving game of illusions, right? You had shifting allegiances because you also had people who would offer to be like to get you there if you were near a town, and that person would then like deliver you in the hands and resell you into slavery. It was really fucked up and uncertain. So there were paid informants, there were covert abolitionists, impromptu guides. The Texas Mexico borderlands was just kind of a free for all. And so this is one of the things that's challenging in discovering the history of it, is that a lot of these were just ad hoc kind of like negotiations in terms of like what you could do to get where you were going, right? A lot of diverse interests, and also just there's always the chance of exploitation and breach trust. So that said, there are a couple places that pop up in the historical record that were guaranteed safe havens. And so that map that I showed you of Piedra Negras and the other two stops, we actually know of several stops on the US side who were known to be destinations on this Texas. I hate Underground Railroad. That sounds too organized. Texas Trails to Freedom. It was a long, hard fucking run. The Jackson Ranch in San Juan, Texas. So this is one of the southernmost. Let me see if I can go back here. So yeah, the southernmost route, like that very down, low arrow. So this is in San Juan. So the Jackson Ranch Cemetery in San Juan, Texas, it's less than a mile from the US-Mexico border. Tombstones have dates as far back as the mid-1800s. Nathaniel Jackson did not believe in the Confederate cause, and he eventually freed his slaves. In the 1850s, his wife Matilda, who was also a freed African-American slave, their children and 5 other families traveled to Texas in 5 covered wagons. Nathaniel and Matilda were a mixed race couple looking for a fresh start. So that where do they go? They go out in the middle of fucking nowhere on the border with Mexico, right? So there's been some research. Dr. Baca Garza, actually, if you look up stories about this, Underground Railroad to Texas, her name will come up. She started this research as a doctoral student, and now she's a doctor herself that teaches down at the University of Texas of the Rio Grande. She actually has documentation, family histories, where they would actually harbor slaves and transport them across the river. During that time, throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s, she thought that maybe, somewhere around 3,000 black slaves had transported just across that route, right? There's also a book that I'll preview at the end here. It's called The Strange Career of William Ellis, the Texas Slave Who Became a Mexican Millionaire. That's by author Carl Jacoby. And what he does is he actually maps out how, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave goers to seize slaves in the South and in the North. But of course, because Mexico refused to make any deals, that place was actually more free and more safe than Canada. Boom, boom, shakalaka, right? So, so this leads to these Texas Trails of Freedom. It got me started in Denton, which I'm just going to blow through because Denton County was smallholder. We didn't have a lot of slaves. This is Jim Chisholm, the cattle king of the Pecos River. He actually started his career here in North Denton County, and he actually also married a slave, which is that's so fucking tricky to deal with. But what actually the other kind of particulars of that is, number one, he freed them all before the Civil War even broke out. And number two, whenever he moved to New Mexico to start his kingdom, his cattle kingdom empire, he gave them land here in North Texas that they used as rest stops, watering holes, reprovision places. They actually were famous for putting on uh, black cowboy barn dances, picnics, and things like that. So this is how I originally got into, like, hey, was there a stop on the Texas Underground Railroad here in Denton? The answer is yes. His daughter, Abidi Chisholm, who claims absolutely that her dad was Jim Chisholm and her mother was the freed black slave. She married Bob Jones, who was brought here from Arkansas as a boy, and he remembers from his childhood, he tells stories of taking food to people in caves on their property here in Denton County that were headed south, and he was forbidden from seeing them. He was just told that whenever you would do a hoot owl, and when you heard a coyote, you would drop the food and leave and go away, and then he would come back the next morning and pick up the empty plates. That was clearly a slave stop, right? So, and this also ties into the 1860 Prairie Match mystery. There was an entire slave insurrection panic after John Brown almost created some shit in 1859. In 1860, there was a series of panics because there were fires that were started spontaneously across several Texas cities. It just so happened to be like record breaking hot weather, like in the 103, 110 range. And there were these new things called phosphorus matches that were catching fire in these stores. This is actually Alec Williams of Denton County. He was the sheriff of Denton County. He came up with the prairie match theory, but the problem was the secessionists who ran a lot of the newspapers, including the Dallas newspaper, actually made it illegal to discuss any reason for these fires other than slave insurrection. And that's what set Texas on the path to joining the Civil War. The Great Hanging at Gainesville was another tragedy. And but of course, I want to speed ahead and go to Juneteenth. So once the slaves were actually freed, you know, literally months after the end of the Civil War, I like to call it emancipation by gunboat. This is where the fucking U.S. Navy showed up to Galveston and were like, oh no, seriously, slaves are free for real. Like fucking let them go, goddammit. And so what happened was General Order number 36 here, the people of Texas are informed that, yeah, they're all free. Now, the difficulty is, of course, a lot of them went back into like indentured servitude because, yeah, you're free. You don't have any money. You don't have a place to stay or sleep. What do you do? Well, you engage in basically, you know, arrangements to do sharecropping. This is where the sharecropping system began. There are a couple of great stories of black cowboys. This is one of the things that I wanted to point out that's a big piece of the puzzle is that I don't think history accurately reminds us that 1 in 3, and maybe even 1, 2, and 4, like half of the cowboys were either African Americans or Tejas vaqueros. So yeah, imagine, you know, people minding cattle and minding sheep and minding small ranging areas, and they run across a runaway slave. Chances are they might give some help or pointing them in the direction. So this is actually another clue to keep an eye out for you history detectives in Austin. So this travel down brings me to, I promised Amy, I said, hey, I did all this cool stuff about Denton. I want to bring in some of the Austin history. So here's where whenever fugitives escape down into Mexico, how am I doing on time? Oh, great. I'm 10 minutes over. So here's kind of the money shot. So about in 1853, there was a thing called the Austin Purge. I don't know if any of you learned about this in school. I'll fucking bet money you didn't. But in 1853, 20 or more quote unquote Mexican families were actually ejected from Austin, Texas on charges that they were horse thieves. Now, this is a very serious charge in Texas. You know that they lynch people in the field for horse thievery, right? Now, one of the interesting things is that this idea of being a horse thief was a law that was sometimes invoked to also cover human property under Texas law. And so that charge was often used and levied against people who were suspected of helping escape slaves. And sure enough, an article in the Texas Gazette of that year gave a much better understanding. Here's a pull quote. Quote, we regard the existence of peon Mexicans among us as decidedly injurious to our slave population, and if anything, worse than so many free Negroes, for they are at the command of slaves for a small bribe, and the latter relies upon a peon capable of running him successfully to Mexico. So this is where a lot of this anti-Mexican, anti-German immigrant, because they were seen as providing assistance. And sure enough, of those 30 families, within 2 years of relocating to Seguin, Texas, some of them were again accused of aiding and abetting escaped slaves in their escape into Mexico. The State Gazette of Austin in 1856 also reported that 3 white men in Chapel Hill were investigated for having abolitionist leanings. And again, they were investigated just because they said something out loud that they were they thought slaveholding was wrong. So the pull quote from that article was, it was proved that the 3 had said several times that they were abolitionists, and that there were over 3,000 abolitionists in the state, and that they sympathized with the Negroes. They were subsequently politely asked by gunpoint to leave the fucking state, and they did, right? And of course, there's numerous stories of abolitionist Methodist ministers who were ejected from the state and or straight up lynched in Texas during this period. So the 1850s saw a statewide purge of abolitionist, Methodist, and Episcopalian ministers. There's a great story. That's why I say great, it's terrifying. Reverend William Bewley in Fort Worth was actually chased down by a lynch mob, brought back. He was lynched. He was burned. His body was dragged down. His bones were put on top of a store in Fort Worth as a warning. And children apparently played with his bones in the street in Fort Worth, Texas. Fucking horrifying. Cool. So there's also the Weber Rancho in Hidalgo County, which has an interesting connection to Austin. Sorry, I'm almost at the end here. Give me 2 more slides. The Weber Ranch and Cemetery lies beside the Rio Grande near the old military highway south of Donna in Hidalgo County. John Ferdinand Weber was a Vermont native who served as a medic in the War of 1812, so he got a land grant in Texas. And so he was one of the earliest Anglo-American settlers in the Austin colony. He was amongst the 300, the old 300. And he was here as early as 1826. So while he was there in Austin, I don't even know where the fuck I am right now. He bought the freedom of Sylvia Hector. She was an enslaved African-American woman and her 3 children. After her freedom, Weber married her and adopted her children. In 1832, his family were the first series of settlers in Weber's Prairie in Travis County, building a fort 16 miles south of Austin, which eventually developed into the village of Weberville. So Weberville is actually named by this couple, interracial couple. So during the 1840s, as more settlers from the Deep South moved into the area there, discrimination and suspicion grew against Weber and his multiracial family. It's also worth noting for our purposes here that Weberville, interestingly, had a ferry crossing on the Colorado River that ceased operations in the 1920s. By 1853, again, the 1853 purge, the Webers moved out. Guess what? They moved to the South Rio Grande Valley. And here he got 8,900 acres from Spanish land grants and established a rancho there, which became a destination spot where they would smuggle them across the river. So for more reading, and that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that you guys in Austin who are interested in this may take up the cause, do some research in your local library, poke around the oral histories and new digitization stuff. One great place to get started is South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War by Alice Baumgartner. She's actually been one of them that's on the front edges of this research, and this is just kind of a compilation that came out just last year. This is barely 11 months old out on the market, and it's fantastic. You heard me mention the strange career about a Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire. That has a lot of great information. But the Empire of Slavery, the peculiar institution in Texas, it's from, I believe it's the early 90s, but it's one of those things that's like a it's a touchstone because it really tells the story about Texas as a slave empire and the challenges that faced the escape into freedom here. There's actually an open source document about the Texas-Mexico borderlands by Tomas Mariette. It's actually a French journal. You can find it open access easily on the internet. Um, and it's actually a treasure trove of information in terms of just its bibliography. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the Community Remembrance Project, which is trying to bring lynching memorials to different places in the United States as part of the Museum of History and Justice in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm part of this group in Denton. There's a group in Austin that just recently had a historical marker dedicated. And that is it. That's all I got for you, kids. So thank you. Thank you, Nerd Nite, for the invitation. And I hope some people will take up this research. Feel free to contact me, Dr. Shaun Treat, one word, at gmail.com. God, I'll talk your ear off.
Well, I do have one question for you, and then we're going to have to call it a night after I do a little bit more of a blurb. And the question is...
What beer am I drinking?
We'll get to that. If someone wanted to get an overview of the slave trade in Austin, is there a book or a specific resource that you would recommend for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most productive ones, especially for drilling down into local history, is to head to your local library. They're going to have access to a lot of history journals and archives. And I know that's been a godsend to me because just trying to do research here in Denton, the librarians have been just invaluable and be able to find things that I wouldn't have even thought about, Amy. And so, yeah, this is where we, trip on to, like, again, some of these oral histories and things like that. But the historical journals are also great for doing reviews. The one that I mentioned before gives a nice bibliography that you can actually piecemeal through. Yeah, that's the best starting point, I think.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for chiming in from Denton, and hopefully I'll be able to return the favor for you at some point.
Hey, beers to be on me when you are, Amy, okay?